Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to the cycle of poverty and arts and crafts.
We have an arts and crafts emergency. We need glue, we need paper, we need pasta.
But, as always, we have to get there. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Savo, is actually my bar mitzvah parsha. It was actually a couple weeks after my 13th birthday, but it was the one that I learned how to read from the Torah. Kind of. I actually only learned how to do the first aliyah, and then my bar mitzvah tutor fired me because when I was asked what I wanted to start with one day, I said nothing, so that was it. I was fired. But then I got another bar mitzvah tutor who was perfect for me. We would just jump around from idea to idea, whatever came up and whatever was interesting to me. We didn't get much further than the first aliyah, but here I am 30 years later, still learning Torah that way, so it seems like it worked. So thank you very much, second bar mitzvah tutor. Anyways, one of the major parts of this parsha is the mitzvah of bikurim, to give some of the first produce of each season as a gift to the kohanim in the temple. This is what it says in the parsha. You shall take of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you will bring from your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put them into a basket, and go to the place which the Lord your God will choose to have his name dwell there. So one of the interesting things about this mitzvah is that the Torah specifically mentions it being brought in a basket. And even though the halacha is that it just has to be some sort of container, it says specifically baskets. And for some reason, I've always been fascinated by that, by the baskets.
I really hope we can find it, because it's my very favorite basket.
And so that's where I decided that I wanted to start this week. Maybe it's because baskets seem kind of silly to me, so it's interesting for me to see them being given such a spotlight in the Torah. Or maybe I was thrilled by the challenge. Is it even possible to find cool stuff about baskets? So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with baskets. If you're ready to see how this could possibly be worth watching, let's dive in. Okay, so one of the interesting things about the bikurim baskets, which I think is pretty well known, is that there was a difference between how poor people did it and how rich people did it.
What can poor people pay you? Nothing.
The Mishnah says that rich people would bring their bikurim in baskets made of silver or gold, and poor people would bring it in wicker baskets, and the bikurim along with the wicker baskets would be given to the kohanim. So not only was there a difference in what kind of baskets people used based on their financial status, there was also a difference in what happened to the baskets. The poor people gave their baskets as part of the gift to the kohanim, but the rich people got to keep their baskets. So that difference on its own is already interesting. But the Talmud connects this to an expression that was apparently common at the time. Rava asks Rabba Bar Mari, what is the origin of the saying that poverty follows the poor? And the answer is the Mishnah that we just talked about, that says that the rich people got to keep their gold and silver baskets, and the poor people had to give away their wicker baskets. So basically, the Gemara is saying that the people who were rich enough to afford fancy golden baskets got their fancy golden baskets back. But the people who were already so poor that they couldn't afford fancy golden baskets, they had to give up the wicker baskets that they did have. So the rich stay rich and the poor get poorer.
Keep saving.
As I said, I think this is pretty well known. When I searched around for stuff about bikurim and baskets, this is always the thing people like to talk about. But this saying is brought in a lot of different contexts in the Talmud, and is then applied in various interesting ways in later sources as well. So I dug around to see where I could find it used in an unexpected way, and the most interesting one that I found is from Kaf HaChaim, which is a commentary on halacha, Jewish law. He's talking about something that happens a lot in halacha. When there's a disagreement in older sources about whether a certain action is required, later works will sometimes say that technically the ruling is like the more lenient opinion, but if someone chooses to follow the stricter opinion, that would be a good thing to do. So I've always been fascinated by this little quirk of Jewish law because to me it somehow simultaneously defies and epitomizes halachic logic. At least to me. It's always been kind of a mysterious puzzle to me. But Kaf HaChaim explains this idea from a Kabbalistic perspective. He says that while a person is experiencing a stage of spiritual growth, and their soul is ascending to a higher spiritual level, then the forces above pay extra attention to them and scrutinize everything that they do down to a hair's breadth. And if their actions are perfect enough, then they get to level up. But he explains that someone whose soul is very refined will be drawn to stringencies, and someone whose soul isn't so refined is drawn towards leniencies. And then he connects that to that saying that poverty follows the poor. In other words, someone who already has a very refined soul is naturally inclined to actions that earn their soul even further refinement. But somebody who doesn't have such a refined soul ends up getting stuck at that level that they're at.
If I were rich, I'd have the time that I like to sit in the synagogue and pray.
But then he says that you can use this as a way of kind of testing yourself. Basically, if you really want to take the easier option, then you could probably benefit from taking the more difficult option. So I thought this was really cool. Even though I'm usually pretty sensitive to feeling extorted into doing holy stuff, I couldn't help but like this just because I think the logic is delightful. Okay, back to baskets. When I was digging around for stuff about the rich people and poor people baskets, I found a Gemara where there's a completely different context in which rich people and poor people have a basket-related difference. It says that it used to be that when people would bring food to the house of a mourner, somebody who just lost a family member, then the rich people would bring it in silver and gold baskets, and the poor people would bring it in wicker baskets. But then the rabbis instituted that everyone should bring food to the house of a mourner in wicker baskets, for the sake of the dignity of the poor people.
I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor. But it's no great honor either.
So, first of all, I obviously like seeing an example of Judaism looking out for the underdog. That's always heartwarming. And it's also fun for me to imagine a resentful rich guy begrudgingly bringing a wicker basket to the house of a mourner. But the thing that really interested me about this is whether this is the origin of the phrase shiva baskets, referring to the platters of food that people send to someone during the first week of the Jewish mourning process. I always thought it was kind of a silly phrase, shiva baskets, but this Gemara suggests to me that it might actually have a deep root in Jewish tradition. I couldn't find anywhere that made that connection, and I don't know if that's because there is no connection and I'm wrong, or if it's because it's so super obvious that nobody has to even say it. Either way, it got me wondering if this is still applicable today. Rambam, or Maimonides, who wrote one of the earliest compilations of Jewish law, does include this as a halacha, but I tried to follow the trail and I couldn't find it come up in any later halachic works. And when I looked around online for Jewish traditions and practices related to mourning, I couldn't find anything that specified what type of containers to use in the house of a mourner. Which is strange to me because it seems to me that it's still very relevant. Shiva baskets seem to have become somewhat of a little industry. There are websites where you can go order beautiful arrangements, and one particular site that I looked at, it seemed like even the fanciest, most elaborate and expensive options had rather modest containers. They were all either wicker baskets or wooden boxes or very nondescript plates. So I wondered if that was a deliberate choice by them in order to comply with this Gemara, or if it's just a way to keep the prices down. If anybody out there watching this has any inside scoop on the Shiva basket industry, please shed some light on this in the comments. Okay, back to the Bikurim, the first fruits. That first Mishnah that we looked at earlier, where it tells us how the rich people used fancy gold and silver baskets and got them back, and the poor people used wicker baskets and didn't get them back, that Mishnah doesn't tell us why it's like that. But there are some other places that do. Bechor Shor, which is a commentary on the Torah, explains that the reason the poor people didn't get their baskets back is because they're not worth very much, and it would be degrading for the poor person to have to ask to get their cheap basket back. So I think that's an interesting way of not embarrassing the poor person. Even if they really do need that basket back, we don't want them to have to look like they need the basket back, so we just don't give them the option to get their basket back. But there's a midrash that offers a different reasoning. It says that baskets are given to the kohanim to merit a gift to the kohanim, which is kind of strange wording, and honestly, it didn't make very much sense to me. What does merit have to do with anything? Tosfos Yom Tov explains that since the poor people are only able to bring a small amount of produce for this ritual, we count the basket as part of it so that it will merit being considered an appropriate gift. But there's actually a bunch of different versions of that midrash, and one of them is that the poor people's baskets are given to the kohanim in order to give merit to the poor people. So instead of the merit being for the gift, it's for the givers, the poor people. Now, in case you were wondering why cheap baskets would be a merit for the poor people, Malbim has you covered. Apparently, the version of the midrash that he had access to was that second one, and he explains it like this. Why did the poor people use wicker baskets in the first place? It's because they couldn't afford to buy a basket for this, so they had to use a homemade basket. And because this was being brought to the temple, and therefore it had to be ritually pure, which would be difficult if this basket was lying around for a while and being exposed to possible sources of ritual impurity, they probably made brand new baskets just for this. So, because they put their own hard work into crafting these baskets just for this mitzvah, they have the merit that their handiwork is considered part of the gift for the kohen. So now this whole thing becomes about the value of arts and crafts, and why our parents still have the macaroni Mother's Day cards we made for them in kindergarten.
One man's trash is another man's present for their father.
So obviously that's fun for me. But Malbim adds another layer and says that this answers a question, which is, why didn't the rabbis decree that the rich people also have to use cheap wicker baskets in order to avoid embarrassing the poor people? Malbim doesn't specifically mention that shiva basket Gemara that we talked about earlier, but it seems to me that that's what he's referencing, because in that case we said that the rabbis did decree that everyone has to use cheap wicker baskets in order to preserve the dignity of the poor people. So Malbim's answer, based on the way he explained that midrash, is that it's not embarrassing in the first place, because they made it themselves with their own hands for the sake of a mitzvah. So according to this whole idea that the poor people don't get their baskets back isn't something that represents something negative or something embarrassing. It's something that is wonderful and beautiful and special because they made it themselves. All right, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, please put your thoughts in the comments, anything I missed, anything that popped into your head that you want to talk about. I love talking to all of you about all of these ideas. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. I hope you find your way out. If you're rich. If you're not rich, then you're probably stuck down here forever.